Welcome. I'm Ryan Pollitt, the National Leader of Manufacturing and Wholesale for BDO in Australia, and it's a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of my team and also on behalf of our partner for today's webinar, AU Manufacturing. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all join us from today, and pay my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us online. BDO provides audit, tax and advisory services to a variety of clients, ranging from large corporate entities to private businesses, entrepreneurs and individuals in various industry sectors, and has a national team of specialists in manufacturing. And that's very much why we're excited to be sponsoring and working with AU Manufacturing on this webinar today and on the ebook that hopefully you would have seen a copy of. I'd also like to draw your attention to the housekeeping slide that it's currently showing on your screen. You're all automatically muted, and we will be accepting questions throughout the session. You can submit these using the question tab. We'll also try to allow time for questions at the end. However, if we run out of time to respond, we'll follow up with you after the webinar concludes. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please click the support button, which is one of the bottom tabs on your screen. And finally, this session is being recorded and all registrants will receive a follow-up email containing a link to the recording and contact details for all of today's speakers. So over the past few months, BDO has proudly been the principal sponsor of AU Manufacturing's editorial series towards 3% R&D, Turbocharging Australia's innovation effort. Contributions to the series came from Australia's leading industry experts, some of whom join us today. The resulting ebook provided a comprehensive collection of thought-provoking and diverse views on what's gone wrong with Australia's approach to innovation over recent years, but it also provided us with potential solutions and a path forward. So to guide us through our discussion today about that path forward, which is so important to the future of our sovereign capability, I'd like to welcome Peter Roberts, Editor-at-Large of AU Manufacturing. Peter is a highly experienced journalist and editor with a career in business journalism, spanning 40 years spent mainly with the Australian Financial Review Group in Australia and Asia. And I can think of few better qualified to host our panel today. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Peter, and let you introduce the outstanding panel of experts we've got to get the conversation started. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan, and thanks to BDO for their support of our editorial series and ebook. We sought community opinion for this series because there's been a sharp fall in Australia's innovation effort in the past 10 to 12 years, as measured by R&D. It's such a serious issue for the country. Every country and every company must invest something in the future if it's to have a future of new ideas, new products, new processes, and new business models. Australia today is simply not investing enough in its future. But today we brought together an expert panel to discuss what has gone wrong, what is going right, and what can be done about it. Let me introduce our panel. Firstly, we have Jefferson Harcourt, Executive Chairman of Grey Innovation Group. Jefferson's company came to prominence during the pandemic when it brought together a consortium of companies to develop a hospital respirator. Jefferson has incubated and supported the development of numerous technology-intensive enterprises. Next, we have Nicola Purser, National Leader of BDO's R&D and Government Grants team. Nicola is an experienced accountant who's worked for a number of leading firms. And in her job today, she helps companies get the most out of the incentives available for research and development. Next, we have Serena Ross, CEO of Circuitwise Electronics Manufacturing. Serena's company is highly innovative and most recently expanded across the Tasman, buying New Zealand's largest PCB printed circuit board manufacturer. And finally, we have Dr. John Howard, Executive Director of the Acton Institute for Policy Research and Innovation. Dr. Howard carried out original research for our editorial series on the problem. Dr. Howard, I'd like to turn to you first today. So where do we stand? Where do we stand with the statistics? What's happening in Australia?
Thanks, Peter. It's an area I've been interested in for 25 years or so. But in terms of where we've come from and where we are, in 1981, going back that far, Australia's proportion of R&D and GDP was 0.9%. and that was a long way behind the OECD average at the time, and a long way behind Australia's major trading partners. But in 2008, it actually reached a peak of 2.24% of GDP. So we've done very well in those preceding years. And it was actually close to the OECD average of 2.4% or 2.24%, so not much behind. And then, unfortunately, from 2008, it's collapsed to now stand at 1.68%. Most other countries were affected by the GFC in terms of their R&D spending, except I think it was China, Taiwan, and one other. But other countries recovered, but not Australia. And the fall in Australian R&D effort was predominantly in the business sector and also in the government sector, and that includes CSIRO and ANSTO and DST. Higher education R&D actually increased, and in many ways people argue that higher education's been doing the heavy lifting in Australia's R&D effort, and a lot of that R&D was in health and clinical sciences, and without this the collapse in R&D would have been much worse. The only downside of that is
John, if I can just to summarise, 1.68% of GDP devoted to research and development or innovation. That's perhaps half of comparable nations that we like to compare ourselves with, the advanced countries, 3 or 4 or even 5% in our region. Some companies are spending. So we're at a low ebb. Now, you mentioned business expenditure has been falling and higher education has come to the fore because of that. Why is business expenditure on R&D falling?
There's a number of reasons, and I think in the paper I listed about 12 or 13 reasons, all in combination, I suppose. A perfect storm of events, I suppose. But some of the main issues around 2008, the immediate years, was the energy sector reduced its R&D as it shifted to renewable energy. But a lot of that investment, not much of that investment happened in Australia, it was done overseas. Similarly, the mining sector, some argue that it shifted from exploration to extraction, but the global mining companies also shifted their R&D approach to an R&D sourcing model. And again, the big companies like Rio and BHP, they source their R&D on a global basis. And Australia isn't part of that equation, part of that sourcing arrangement at the moment. There are patches where we're doing well. There was some increase over the period in ICT R&D. The other issue that we face is that Australia is dominated by the services economy, 80% of our GDP, or thereabouts, and those sectors tend not to be R&D intensive, and we suffer, if you like, a structural problem. And the other issue is...
Let's move on, John, before we please. We could talk all day on this subject, and I'd like to turn to Jefferson Harcourt, though. Jefferson, you come from a private sector and an innovative incubator. Do you share this rather bleak outlook of Australian innovation at the moment?
Oh, Peter, I've always been a bit, I wouldn't say bleak, but certainly it's frustrating insofar as there is a formula that's worked very well, and that's, you know, and we don't seem to be talking enough about case studies. And you know, if we look at the US SBIR program, that is to me a fantastic case study. It's been running for over 30 years with bipartisan support. Why would we not be moving to emulate that far more? And in fact, I think about 5 or 10 years ago, the Victorian government did run an SBIR program, and it was incredibly successful. But it only ran for a few years and stopped. And it's an absolute shame, because it is, if you look at the SBIR program, it is incredible for a relatively small spend. I think the US SBR spend is in the order of a couple of billion, maybe 3 billion. Now we spend 4.3 at the moment on R&D. It's headline figures. So for a very large country like the US, it's 3 billion is not a large spend. Yet the benefits are measurable and historically, statistically relevant. The outputs are hundreds of billions of dollars of value, hundreds of thousands of jobs that generate long-term development of companies who manufacture. And of course, all that program is doing is unlocking government as a customer. And government has needs that aren't met. They have a requirement for innovation, and all they're doing is unlocking that customer base to a very eager supply chain of innovators to fulfill that new requirement, and then that is effectively their kickstart into supplying that technology to industry and other governments globally. So there's the model, and that's always been my frustration, Peter, that it's there, it works so well that the US government have run it basically untouched for over 3.5 decades. I'm happy to talk about what elements of it would and wouldn't work here, but we don't seem to talk about it at all, and that really puzzles me.
Thank you, Jefferson. So Australian government doesn't buy from the locals. We've heard that no public servant gets sacked for buying from IBM. This is a truism that you see all the time, is it?
It's a great campaign, and absolutely. So let's not fault the government purchasing. They're doing what they've been asked to do, but I think we need to really challenge that. It does make me very sad when you look at the spend on the NBN as one example. We'd have to have an international record for a country to spend that much money on a program and not have a single tech startup out of it. I can't think of any other country that would have made that investment and not thought to bring up some very capable businesses that already exist who could have manufactured switch gear and so on. I mean, there are a couple of exceptions, I guess, but really most of the tech went to, or the tech spend went to, of course, Alcatel-Lucent and Dow Corning. Big country, you think we could probably work out how to manufacture some fiber optic and lay it ourselves. We dug the ditches, of course, that's what we do well. I mean, imagine if we imported foreign workers to dig all the ditches, there'd be riots in the street, and of course we didn't do that. We employed locals to do the menial stuff, but of course the ditches were dug with equipment bought from Germany. So we tend to just outsource all the clever stuff and do the manual labor ourselves. And there are many companies I know of, Serena would know of them, who manufacture products today that could have turned into a global business on the back of a large contract like supplying switchgear and other things to the NBN, and we just missed that completely. And there are many more examples, of course, Mikey and so on, and the outcome isn't necessarily good. So yeah, you don't get fired for buying IBM, but buying IBM doesn't always work either. I truly believe that the businesses I know of just in Victoria alone would have delivered a fantastic version of Mikey, and we could be exporting that solution around the world. Instead, we spent it on a foreign company who completely mucked it up.
What about the private sector? Does the private sector buy Australian? Is there any area where this is actually happening?
In Australia, we tend to not quite have the ecosystem or the innovation ecosystem, because the large businesses here tend to be multinational outposts who don't have a mandate to do R&D. It's perhaps more sales than development and innovation that happens in the head office. So there are some exceptions that I'm aware of, certainly in Perth, where I've moved to after COVID. I moved over west, and it's fascinating just how different that economy is to east. I hadn't seen it. Again, I don't think we really understand that difference on the east coast. But in WA, you have in Perth, you've got obviously the very large mining companies, but they are surrounded by some very clever mining services businesses. And that's the first time I've really seen an innovation ecosystem that does work, but it's in a very narrow area. And I think that's an outlier in Australia. So no, we don't tend to see the larger companies partnering with smaller SMEs or spin-outs, supplying back into those bigger corporates. That happens elsewhere, but not here.
Thanks, Jefferson. Turning now to Nicola from BDO. Nicola, you deal with companies claiming R&D tax concessions or under the R&D tax incentive. Can companies here afford to innovate? Are we doing enough innovation, do you think?
I probably get a very skewed view of the world, Peter, in terms of every company that I deal with is actually doing really cool stuff. Obviously, Dr. Howard has pointed out the numbers, and Jefferson's seen it from being in business, that definitely we're obviously not doing enough. But there are really some really clever entrepreneurial people in this country, and we don't do a lot to celebrate them. I think we should definitely be doing more of that.
And the R&D tax incentive is the major, or perhaps the standout incentive that's offered to companies. Is that working well? What's the history? Has it been stable throughout that history?
Look, I'd have to agree with Chris Gale's article that he wrote for the ebook in terms of the R&D tax incentive has been pretty stable in its guise since its inception in 2011. Prior to that, we had a lot of chop and change with the R&D tax concession, and really businesses invest in R&D for the long term, and they really need certainty as to what the return's going to be for them. So I think at the moment, overall, the program is working quite well. I would say that we're not seeing a lot of consistency in the administration of the program, and we need to see more from the ATO and AusIndustry, who jointly administer the program, in the consistency of approach. And I also think we get a lot of complication with the program, and I think there are lots of opportunity for the administrators to look at things like safe harbours that on your expenditure that would make the program easier to access for companies. I've got a client at the moment that's just been through an ATO review on its R&D, and it's doing some really cool, innovative stuff. But from the back of that ATO review, they've now had to employ somebody full-time just to substantiate the expenditure on R&D to give them confidence in claiming into the future. So I do think that we've overcomplicated the system.
So compliance costs are increasing for companies?
Definitely. And we've actually just seen recently a draft of the new application form for potentially from 1 July 2025 was actually increasing the level of questioning from AusIndustry, which definitely looks like it's driven by the ATO. That's actually going to further increase the compliance costs. We've also seen the ATO from back under the tax concession having some pretty simple rulings around proportion of overheads that you could claim. But now the ATO expects companies to go line by line through their GL to work out whether a particular expense was in relation to the registered core or supporting R&D activities. So definitely the level of compliance in Australia compared to what we see with R&D regimes overseas is a lot higher.
And of course,
I do go back a long way writing about business and innovation, and I recall that when the first incentives came in the Hawke-Keating government, it was a very simple 150% tax deduction for R&D. So it was blanket. You just had to identify what your R&D was, 50% additional tax benefit. Now, what is it? And over that time, since then, it's been chopped and changed, as you say, but also cut. There's pressure every year from the ATO and from Treasury to cut the cost of this scheme. I want to ask you to criticise Treasury or the ATO. That's your bread and butter. But what is the incentive actually worth to a company today, and is it worth claiming?
Yeah, so we've now got a dual tiered system between companies that are have a turnover, aggregated turnover of under 20 million and those that are over the 20 million. And that 20 million threshold hasn't changed since the program was brought in 2011. And that's something that we probably would like the government to have a look at. But in terms of the companies under 20 million, it's a 18.5% above the company tax rate incentive. So basically what that means is that companies can get up to 48.5 cents in the dollar cash back if they've got sufficient losses. Which is really beneficial and allows those companies to reinvest that money into R&D to continue that path to commercialisation. I think it's really important to note, though, that it is a cash flow benefit. Once you start earning income in that company, then you can't pay franked dividends to the shareholders until you've paid enough tax to claw back the R&D refunds that you've previously got. But most companies, they just want the cash now to be able to reinvest and to continue down that path, and they'll worry about that problem down the track. For companies over 20 million, there has been a real important change in the last couple of years, and that was the introduction of the intensity premium. So for companies, the base rate for companies over 20 million is only an 8.5% incentive component, which if you go back to what you mentioned when the first introduced in 1986, we not only had a 150% deduction, but you also had a company tax rate at 48%. So your net benefit was about 24%. So that's now dropped to 8.5% for those companies, and most manufacturers are going to be over 20 million turnover. There is now this intensity premium, which means that companies can get an additional 8%, so up to 16.5%, where they're spending more than 2% of total expenses on R&D. But what we're seeing is that's not really benefiting the manufacturers, because it's quite hard to get over that 2% when you're in with a high cost of goods sold. Who it's benefiting is definitely in the ICT sector.
Thanks, Nicola. Now I'd like to turn to Serena Ross of CircuitWise. Serena, you don't claim the R&D tax incentive because you do. You focus on a different kind of innovation. Can you tell me about the innovation in CircuitWise?
Yeah, so the way we work is we look always for the little small incremental innovations. So we have a development team, software and hardware in-house, that will focus on all the areas of our production, manufacturing process, and find ways to automate a role or any repeated task that someone has. So if someone in receiving is doing a task and constantly repeating, they'll put their hand up and say, is there a way that we can automate this? And so we have a team that will sit with them and find out whether or not there's a piece of software that they can implement or develop, or a piece of hardware that's going to make their job easier. So we're always looking at the small changes and the small increases in production efficiency, and that eventually leads to a big outcome.
Can you give us an example of innovation that's come from this this process?
Yeah, so we've got two big ones here that we have sold internationally, but now we've taken that in-house. So we've got some inventory management shelves where we used to, on a PCBA, which is what we manufacture, there can be up to 300 different components on that PCB, and you would have to go into a warehouse and try and find all those components when you are kitting for a job. So that could take sometimes up to 8 hours to find all the components in a warehouse. So we developed electronic shelves internally where all you need to do is go to a PDA, press the job number, and then all the lights light up. So it's first in, first out. It always ensures that there's full traceability on the components, but more importantly, it does reduce time. So that 8-hour job now takes 20 minutes to kit with extreme accuracy. So that was one piece of innovation that we made in-house, and that actually started because we were running night shift, and the night shift operators were having problems finding components, and they wanted an easier way to find components without having warehouse people here. So now everyone in our facility is empowered to pick their own parts. They are able to just pick up the PDA, and they can be someone who can find a component. The other big innovation that we developed in-house was in our receiving. So if you go back 4.5 years, 5 years ago, we were receiving about 1/4 of the amount of components of what we're receiving now, and we had 2 team members. The process of receiving in our industry, again, we receive a lot of components per month, is quite a slow, laborious process where you have to look up the part number on the bill of material, on the PO in our system, and book it in and check all the digits are correct. So we've developed a system in-house where all you have to do is put the part on the receiving box, it scans, books the part in, prints a label, done. And so we've been able to receive, like I said, 4 times the amount of components over the last 4 years, and we still have those same 2 receiving staff. So yeah, they're 2 big changes 2 little changes that made a big difference as we grew.
So cumulatively, these make a difference. And over the years, I understand you've increased production without too many more new staff. What's the figures there?
Yeah, so we're doing about 4 times the revenue we were 4 years ago, and we have almost the exact same production staff. We have increased our overhead over the past, in particular in the past year, as we're looking to acquire. But our focus in the last, in our last 10 years has been on the efficiency of production, but now we are moving and looking more at overhead and how overhead time is utilised, and looking for ways now to automate that. So hopefully we should be able to grow in the next tranche of growth without having to significantly add more overhead.
And finally, I'd like to ask you about innovation in financing. You purchased a company in New Zealand, a big move for a small Australian business with the help of Quadrant Capital. How is that innovative in your opinion, the relationship with them?
So the Quadrant came in and invested in our company over a year ago now, and they were very much focused on the innovation that we have in-house, and they did a lot of research on other manufacturers globally to see how we kind of stacked up against them. And so they are really helping us acquire other businesses like ours and put our innovations in their facilities. So it's been really exciting to see, because I don't think there's a lot of private equity firms that have looked at contract manufacturing before us, so electronics manufacturing. So they've been a great partner for us, and you know, they're really helping us in areas that I'm and my team aren't skilled in, more in the M&A space.
Thanks, Serena. Just back to Jefferson Harcourt for a moment. Jefferson, your company has incubated a number of technology-intensive business. There is money around for innovation. How does it work within your company?
Yeah, Peter, we spent the first 2.5 decades providing services to other companies to effectively outsource their R&D, and we worked with an investment community as well, either directly and helping our clients find investment, or working with our clients' investors together with our client. And then we shifted the model to spinning our own businesses out and raising investment directly into those spin-out companies, which we initiate. And we've found that certainly there's a venture community in Australia, of course, and that's been through a number of generations of VC over the years. And so there is venture available, there's grant money available. I think family offices for us have been a key supporter actually of early stage investment. It is very difficult relative to perhaps other countries to get investment in early stage. We've found in Australia, I think we are not known for investing in early stage businesses, and my personal opinion is that we relatively have a short-term focus on a return. I think one of the advantages perhaps of an older economy, if you look at Germany, you have that Mittelstand model, very large family-owned companies that have sometimes a 30-year horizon, and they think in those sorts of timeframes. We tend to want every business, every startup to be afterpay. So we sort of highlight these businesses which are really often not particularly tech. I would call it a complex tech business. Might be a great business model, it might not be. That's not comment about the ethics of afterpay, but it's that is not. It's very difficult to measure. Say a medical device commercialization that might be a very worthwhile, potentially lucrative exit, but it's a 10-year, or often it can be a 20-year cycle. And I think Australia is quite young at understanding that. And a lot of people are surprised to hear that Tesla is 25 years old. SpaceX, I think, is well over 20 years old. We tend to think that you get an 18-month return, and it just doesn't work like that most of the time. So yeah, it is. I think we do lose a lot of our innovation to other economies. A lot of R&D funding or taxpayer funding that goes into, say, pharmaceutical startups is then that benefit moves offshore as those companies scale, and quite often that technology, like drug, is not even available to Australians because our market's so small. So there's a real issue with capturing the benefit and supporting funding, and we don't do it well, in my view.
Thanks, Jefferson. I'd like to turn back to Dr. Howard now. We're looking here at funds supporting innovation, John. Do the capital markets in Australia support innovation?
I think, as I said to you, this would have been an important part of the 3% project. but I was encouraged to have a look at it when the robotics company was taken over, if you like, by an overseas company. We see this pattern continually, where Australian companies reach a mid-growth stage, and inevitably they look for growth capital, and inevitably they find themselves being the subject of a takeover or an acquisition. I think there's a failure in our capital markets. It's very heavily biased towards the banking system, the oligopoly, and they invest very heavily in property, real estate, and retail. Their risk profiles and APRA also have regulations which limit their capacity to be able to make high risk investments. We used to have a development bank, AIDC, which was specifically established for those sorts of purposes. The Commonwealth Development Bank is now absorbed into the CBA. Other countries have business banks, which are specifically targeted at this mid-size, mid-growth, mid-stage issue or problem. So, yes, I believe there's a failure in our capital market, and I don't think it's serving us well, and we're not really seriously addressing it.
Recently, the federal government has got back into the business of backing companies with co-investment through the National Reconstruction Fund, and perhaps earlier than that, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. Do you see this as a good thing, or is it working in your opinion? Is it the right model?
I think it's all good. It's all makes up part of the mix. But we've had, the NRF is now up and running, but we've also had the First Made in Australia agency set up. We've had the Net Zero Emissions Agency established. We've seen various initiatives like PSI Quantum. The issue there is how that actually relates and turns back into a consistent and coherent approach to industry policy and innovation policy. We're very critical at the moment about the plethora of programs that are active in the innovation ecosystem, and not just the Commonwealth, but also the states. And I guess we're nudging towards industry policy, innovation policy, but I think we've got a fair way to go before we sort of start to see that. We don't know, for example, how much First Made in Australia will actually support R&D. We don't know how much the National Reconstruction Fund will be supporting R&D. And then we've got the other innovation programs like the growth program, or the industry growth program. So it's all a bit of a mixed match, if you like.
So we have seen a change in the rhetoric and talk about investment in energy transition, critical minerals, and defence, I guess, as areas where the government is trying to increase R&D. Jefferson, do you see this working? Are we got runs on the board from this, or is it talk?
I think it can work, absolutely. It's interesting to talk about subsidies, and I think that there is perhaps a perception that supporting Australian innovation means subsidies, and I don't think that's necessarily the case at all. So I think as long as we get the messaging right, that what we're really saying is let us supply a product at full market price. We don't need to make profit, but we need a first customer. We'll cover the cash flow requirement from the business. We can get investment if we have a customer, and it's very hard to explain to other governments. And when we've had trying to export defence equipment manufactured in Australia, very sophisticated, high-value technology, and the first awkward conversation we always have to have is why we haven't sold anything in Australia. I'd love to not have to have that conversation. So I think there's some misnomers around what it means to support that innovation, and you know, I was saddened to see the very critical response in the paper towards this National Reconstruction Fund and manufacturing. I think people really came out almost viscerally negative about perhaps what that meant, and I don't know why, and I couldn't understand, and perhaps others on the panel will know more about it than I, but I was just really surprised at why this negativity around investing in developing more value-added product. I think that's such a simple, logical thing. I don't know what people want to leave for their grandkids. So I was, you know, this was in the Australian, in the AFR, quite a lot of commentary, very critical about investing in manufacturing, and it was leave it alone. We're not good at it. Do other things. Well, I'm not sure what those other things are, and we are good at it. We just don't do enough of it.
Well, I've worked at the FR for 27 years, and I can tell you the attitude in there is that these things are picking winners, they're subsidies, and they should be avoided. And that's been an unchanging attitude for decades.
Peter, so I'm glad
Nicola,
you mentioned that. Sorry, just because you just hit the landmine for me, and that picking winner has to be one of the most dangerous pieces of rhetoric. At some point, you back the most successful player or players. I mean, you can have the SBIR program again will back multiple companies, so there's some redundancy in the supply chain, but they are the ones who have risen to the top. We pick winners every day in life. I mean, it's the grand final coming up here next week. So we have no problem in the concept of picking winners. In fact, our culture's built on it. So why that is such a negative thing, I don't understand. As long as the process is transparent and you're letting the market work, if you don't pick winners, you'll give everyone one piece of the Lego set and no one has enough to do anything.
And I think
yes,
we
Nicola,
have been.
are there any models you could point to internationally? Sorry, John, I'll come back to you in a moment. Sorry, right. Nicola, are there any models you can point to internationally that we could perhaps learn from in terms of how we incentivize innovation?
I think every country grapples with it. You know, I sit on our Global Centre of Excellence for R&D, and we sort of, you know, as Dr. Howard and Jefferson have pointed out, you know, other countries do have programs that work and are better than what we've got. I think one of the issues that we've got in Australia, and picking up on something that Jefferson said, is the short-term thinking, and that's very much for the short political cycles as well. I see a lot of grant programs where they open and close very quickly, and there's no ability for companies to get the right applicants in. So because they haven't, you know, the time frame might be that the grant opens and closes within 6 weeks, and you need to be prepared to spend a certain amount of money, and you need to have your project completed within 12 months. So, you know, it just then narrows the pool of applicants for that particular program. I think a lot more strategy around grant programs and looking further than the immediate political cycle would certainly improve. In terms of other jurisdictions, I mean, certainly with their R&D tax incentives, there's some, you know, some tweaks that I think we could pick up on, things like, you know, that just lower that compliance cost. Things like in the US, if a researcher is at least 80% involved in R&D, you can just claim 100% of their salary. You don't have to justify why it's 80% or 81% or whatever the case may be, as is required by the ATO here. But I think, you know, the model that Jefferson was talking about at the beginning, the SBIR, you know, is definitely something that we should be looking at as a good example.
Thanks, Serena. If I can go back to you for a moment, in your company, you've devolved to a certain extent innovation to the shop floor, to individuals to come forward with ideas that you then take action from. Do you see any lack of willingness to innovate amongst the workforce?
Absolutely not. So in our workforce, you know, we've instilled a culture of, you know, just because we innovate, your role doesn't mean you're going to be made redundant, you know, or your job's not going to be available. All it's doing is helping us grow without having to find more people. In an industry like electronics, it's extremely difficult to find the right people and the right skills. And so over the years, we've encouraged for people to put their hand up and find ways to make their job easier and more accurate and focus their their brain power on things that are complex and are, unique, and they're not able to automate. So we don't have a situation here where people are worried about, if we bring in a piece of software, I'm not going to be here next week. So that has really created a culture of everybody getting on board and really utilising the team that we have to make things better. So yeah, we definitely don't have any pushback at all internally, which is great.
Thanks, Serena. We're getting some very interesting questions through from people watching today. I'm not going to be able to get through them all, I'm afraid. This is a general question, perhaps for Dr. John Howard. Is there a well-funded technology innovation business development organisation to coordinate policy and delivery? Do we have that in Australia? Is that something we need?
I think one of the problems is, and we've alluded to that a couple of times, is that there are, and because of the nature of our constitutional system, we have a large number of ministries. I think it's about 14, with sovereign ministerial responsibility for various aspects of the innovation system. That comes together at the cabinet level, but we don't have what the German system has, or the Korean or the US system. We don't have a national science foundation or a national research foundation to actually do the top-down approach to setting priorities and allocating resources. I think if you look to the US at the moment, and the amount that the National Science Foundation is investing through the Inflation Reduction Act and the Chips and Sciences Act in all sorts of areas, and they're very large amounts of money. We tend to have a system which is distributed, if you like, and the amounts of money aren't all that great. We've got the largest single item is the R&D tax incentive, but we've added on a few other programs. And okay, the money sounds big when you sort of spread it over 10 years, but on an annual basis, it's not all that large. And when you look at something like quantum or AI, there has to be very large amounts of money invested for us to be in the game. And I'll just add very quickly that we need to talk about the role of public research and how it interacts with business research. And what I noticed when I was looking around the systems, international systems, is the US and the Germans have very strong public research laboratories, or systems of public research laboratories. And the history tells us about the interaction, Silicon Valley is classic, for example, between public research and private research. We haven't really developed that well. We've been defunding the CSIRO, and I think there are issues we need to address.
Thank you. Jefferson, I see you vigorously agreeing there. Do you want to come in there?
Yeah, it's nice to be positive. So I think John raises a great point about CSIRO, and if you look at the German model of Fraunhofer, I think there's which is an incredible institution, and I've been lucky enough to visit a few of their operations in Germany. And one of the, as I understand, key differences is that Fraunhofer is very clear in its mandate that it's not to commercialize, it's there to support industry. It's government funded, and part government, part industry funded to support industry to commercialize. And that model again has delivered significant output that's measurable. I think CSIRO, and I'm not critical of CSIRO, I think they do some great work, but it is conflicted. It is trying to spin out businesses as fast as it can, and that makes it quite confusing and potentially even risky for innovators to operate with CSIRO. And there are examples of where technology's been licensed out, improved on, and then commercialized by CSIRO. So that can get very complicated. I think there is we as smaller businesses are up against very powerful marketing from these large institutions, universities and CSIRO and others, who can really present a very strong case to government. And so there's really a lot of competition from these groups who really do need to partner with industry to commercialise. So we look at the output, the commercialisation output from universities and others, and really I think they're missing that key piece of partnering with industry. I think they market very well at getting a very large piece of the R&D money that is available from government, and I don't think that's the right formula. I think the formula needs to be more along the lines of how the Germans and the Americans do it.
So Serena, I take it you wouldn't, when you think of innovation, go to a university or go to a CSIRO. How could the government help you do what you're doing well?
Look, to be honest, the approach that we've taken in our business is, in terms of the innovation side, we aren't looking to the government for help. What we are looking to the government for help in, and they have been very helpful in the last few years in particular, especially since COVID, is in supporting manufacturing in the space that we're in for new equipment and that sort of thing, so that we're able to compete globally in that regard. So that has been really great, and that's something that has definitely shifted, I think, since COVID. There's been a lot more focus on manufacturing, which has been excellent, and there's been a flurry of grants that definitely had bolstered our industry, and we were an industry that was really suffering if you go back into the early 2000s, mid 2000s, 2010, and in mass exodus, everyone moving to China. And the issue, I guess, that we had, that even though technology had evolved significantly and we could be potentially cost competitive with China on a lot of things, the equipment that was involved to get up to that level is extremely expensive. So I think our business and a lot of other businesses in our industry have been very fortunate to be given a lot of government grants over the last few years to kind of help get us up to the same level as competing countries like China and other Asian countries. So that's been really great. So I can't fault the government in that way. I feel like they've definitely helped us for that. And but in terms of our incremental innovation, that's just something, how we do business essentially.
Thank you. Dr. Howard, again, you mentioned earlier on that universities were taking up the slack, or appeared to be, because business was faltering in terms of its R&D spend. Are universities researching the right sort of things? Has this been good for universities that they are bearing such a burden?
I think the R&D, or the research in universities, is very heavily concentrated around health and medical research, and there's very little doubt that that's helped various aspects of the health industry. But when you look at the data, there is a mismatch between where higher education research focuses its attention and if you like, the R&D focus of industry, for example. And while universities do a fair bit of R&D in the engineering IT area, it's not really linking well with what industry is doing in the manufacturing and other research-intensive aspects of industry. There's I think the universities have had an uneven record in their approach to research commercialisation and technology transfer. There are some that do it exceptionally well, and there are others who have let it lapse, if you like, or just haven't given it sort of priority. And it does require skilled people and people who know how to work in industry and with industry. I think that's an area where there is scope for substantial improvement in that linkage between higher education and business.
If I could weigh in here just for a moment, we do have a lot of belief in this country in sort of a technology from universities, from CSIRO push, that CSIRO will come up with a great idea and industry will pick it up and run with it and commercialise it. Now that's contrary to the institutions in Europe that Jefferson Harcourt mentioned, the Fraunhofer Institutes and so on, which don't invent things. they wait, and industry comes to them and brings a problem to them. So that's the difference, I think, in those two countries. Jefferson, we have a question. What is the next big government purchases? This is from a viewer. That should be the platform for building new Australian capabilities. Can you name an area or areas? Pick some winners.
Well, we have supported, certainly in Victoria, medical device commercialisation. There's a lot of energy going on in that area, and I think that we have some good success stories in Australia, oft-cited Cochlear and ResMed and so on. There is a good ecosystem here in Melbourne for that kind of commercialisation, research and commercialisation. There's a great clinical trial network. So, you know, I'd love to see that SBIR program brought back in place to get that into health purchasing. And really, this process of translating research through that early TRL level into a later stage and finally a commercial product is really about communication and working as a demand-driven system. You know, quite often a great technology can meet 80% of the requirements, but not make it because it doesn't fulfill all the requirements. But it could have easily done that if they just started working together earlier. And so that's really what SBIR does. So medical devices to me would be a very logical one. I think we all talk about higher value add for perhaps mining. It's difficult as a high labour cost country, but I'm sure with the right investment, we should be extracting more value from the resources we export. National priority areas in terms of environmental, I think is another important issue. I mean, water is often described as a key problem area globally. Australia's relationship with water, I think, is in many ways unique. We could be a global leader in how we manage water and export that to the world as well. So there's just a few. I think you could do many PhDs on that area though, Peter, and I'd love to have a crystal ball on that one.
We have another question from a viewer. Is the R&D tax incentive too skewed to TRL 1 to 6? Now, you raised the idea of TRL. Would you like to explain that, Jefferson, and perhaps answer that question? Are we looking at TRL 1 to 6 and not elsewhere?
Well, certainly, my understanding is it is focused in earlier stage R&D. And I think that is appropriate because that's where it's very difficult, much harder to get that investment at those earlier stages. So I think Nicola probably has more specific knowledge as to exactly where it fits, but I would say it probably is focused on those earlier stages. Later stage, you can get more investment dollar to support it. So I don't have a problem with it being focused on those earlier stages.
I think just jumping in there that, you know, certainly I'd agree with what Jefferson had said there, but the legislation itself does fund the R and the D, and I think sometimes the regulators are much more attuned to considering that the research part of it fits the definition more neatly than some of the development work. I mean, over the last few years with the temporary full expensing measures, people have been able to claim a lot more in the development side, but that finished, that was a COVID measure that finished at the end of 2023. So moving back into the status quo, which, yeah, I think the R&D tax incentive is going to be much more focused again at the early stage.
Thank you. Well, we've heard a lot of differing opinions here, but I'd like to go back to Dr. John Howard for perhaps a final word, John. Has anything changed since we published this editorial series and ebook? Has anything changed in Canberra? Has there been any movement? Are you seeing any more engagement from Canberra?
I think what we have seen is a bit of action and setting up new programs like Future Made in Australia and NRF getting up and running. But I think there is thinking going on in Canberra. There is a project to develop the R&D strategy, which came out of the Universities Accord. The Minister is taking that seriously, but that's going to take some time to work through the processes. I guess the issue that is still there, unfortunately, is that we don't think as one Australia. We think of 6 states and territories. So when you're looking at foreign investment attraction, we've got state governments competing with each other. We don't use the foreign direct investment lever to promote R&D. So I think it's public administration in Australia is complex, like it is in other parts of the world. But I think I can see a determined commitment to actually address that issue. We've been talking about it for a while. I think people in government have been listening. And I think we can see a pathway to improvement, but it is incredibly complex. Public policy generally is complex, but it requires leadership and drive and commitment to actually cut through and deliver outcomes.
Thank you, John. Leadership and a quick commitment from Canberra, but it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. Well, that's all from me, Peter Roberts. And before I finish, I'd like to thank our panelists, Nicola Purser, Dr. John Howard, Serena Ross, and Jefferson Harcourt. Now it's back to Ryan Pollitt from BDO.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, amazing discussion. I really enjoyed listening to that, and I just wanted to summarize a few of the key points that I took out of the webinar, which was excellent. So Dr. John, thank you for your comments. Very much appreciated understanding some of the context around how we've peaked with the innovation in around 2008, and it's really been sort of a bit of a downward spiral since then. But and some of the reasons for that being innovation and investment moving offshore, particularly in energy and to an extent in mining. You highlighted that there's been a failure in capital markets, particularly with banking being focused on real estate and retail. But there's a lot of positivity as well in terms of some of the programs that were highlighted, the National Reconstruction Fund, which is a step in the right direction. But, the message I took was that we still need a consistent and coherent innovation policy. And perhaps there's some things we can learn from the likes of Germany or the US around, the strength of public research and how that connects into the private sector. But definitely some moves in the right direction and a pathway to improvement, which was great to hear. And Jefferson, thank you for your comments as well. I really took a lot away from understanding the role of government purchasing and how important that can be. You mentioned that often companies just really need a customer, and that sort of step the first step in that direction is really going to get them over the line. It sounds like there's a bit of work to be done around the private sector innovation ecosystem that we have in Australia. Perhaps we can learn something from mining and mining services in terms of that. But again, some positive comments around the National Reconstruction Fund and Made in Australia. And yeah, definitely nothing wrong with picking winners, and agree with your comments on that. Really we're just talking about successful businesses, and there's no harm in backing those companies. So thank you for your comments. And Nicola as well, really insightful in terms of understanding the R&D incentive, how it is working well overall, and there's a really strong cash benefit there, particularly for those companies obviously under the 20 million threshold. But big opportunity to remove complexity and compliance costs moving forward, and really make that program even more effective than it currently is. And Serena, thank you as well. It was really interesting learning about CircuitWise and some of the innovation and the examples that you gave. Was amazing to hear how you've grown the business 4 times revenue without changing the number of employees. That's an incredible statistic. And also really interested to hear how that innovation is now being implemented in other businesses as well that are sort of within the network that you're working with your PE partner. So thank you as well for your comments. But yeah, I think it's just my role now to close the webinar. So thank you once again to all the panelists, Nicola, Serena, Jefferson, and Dr. Howard, for sharing your expertise and experience and your time with us today. Thank you to Peter for your expert guidance of the discussion and for providing BDO with the opportunity to be involved in the Towards 3% campaign and to further our advocacy on behalf of Australia's manufacturing sector. And finally, I want to thank everyone that's been listening in and watching today, for taking the time to join us and engaging in this important conversation. If you haven't already done so, please do go and download a copy of the ebook, either from the AU Manufacturing website or from the BDO website. And we'll send a link through after this webinar for you to access that. But yeah, thank you to everyone. And on behalf of BDO and AU Manufacturing, we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much.
Thank you.